Okay, welcome everyone. All right, so welcome to the law school. For those of you who aren't law students, my name is Julian Koo, and representing the law school here. I'm very pleased to host this event, which is part of the university's Hoftra Votes series of public events this fall semester in the run-up to this November's midterm congressional elections. Just in case you want to know the date, in case you have something to do that day. Tuesday, November 6th. Keep that on your calendar. We're having Hoftra University is sponsoring a series of events on public issues related to the congressional elections. Just for your information, the next event in this series will occur on Tuesday evening, 6:30, where New York Times columnist and Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman will speak on the economy in the 2018 election. So, in addition to these programs, the university is sponsoring a voter registration drive aimed at younger voters. So if you're not registered, please consider registering. So getting to today's program, I'm very proud to host and moderate today's event, which is entitled, Are Trade Wars Easy to Win or Even Worth Having? It's on a topic near and dear to my heart, but one that until very recently would have bored almost everyone else, including my own students. But it is, I think, a very important issue. The topic is trade policy. In 2016, then candidate Donald Trump placed trade policy at the heart of his presidential campaign. Here's a quote from his 2016 campaign, for those of you who don't remember. Here's a quote from President Trump. Hillary Clinton unleashed a trade war against the American worker when she supported one terrible trade deal after another, from NAFTA to China to South Korea. A Trump administration will end that war by getting a fair deal for the American people. The era of economic surrender will finally be over. So that was candidate Trump in 2016, and in the past 2 years, President Trump has pursued a very distinct and different U.S. trade policy that is different from the trade policy that probably would have been followed by Hillary Clinton, a war that was followed by prior presidents, both Republican and Democratic. So what I'm going to do is I want to bear with me and introduce a little bit about the background of the topic before we go to our speakers for today. So President Trump has, I think in my view, has adopted 4 distinctive features to his trade policy that really marks a break with prior trade policy in the United States. First, since taking office, President Trump has made renegotiating existing trade agreements a top priority. So he launched renegotiations with a number of countries that the United States already had free trade agreements with. And so the 2 most recently, he launched a renegotiation with South Korea, which was recently concluded and signed. And also, very recently, he launched a renegotiation with Canada and Mexico over the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was actually the agreement he was most hostile to in some ways. And just this past Sunday night, a few minutes before midnight, the United States and Canada and Mexico announced that they have reached an agreement for a new version of the North American Free Trade Agreement called the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. President Trump he withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have created an 11-country free trade zone across the Pacific. So the renegotiating or changing trade agreements is a big part of his new policies. Second, he has experimented with the unilateral imposition of tariffs on national security grounds under a U.S. law giving the president very broad discretionary powers in this front. Used only a few times in the last 50 years, President Trump has deployed this power to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum, and on all countries, although in different levels and in different ways, but including countries such as Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. He's also suggested that he might use his power in his open investigation to use his power to impose tariffs on national security grounds on imported automobiles. So go out and buy your Mercedes now before it's too late. Okay. Third, President Trump has really focused tariffs on China for 2 reasons. One, national security like other countries, but also with respect to China under Section 301, which are citing violations of intellectual property committed by the Chinese government or Chinese companies against U.S. companies. So U.S. law also allows the United States government to impose trade penalties for the theft of intellectual property or for the unfair or failure to protect intellectual property. But this power also has not been used, and in fact, prior U.S. governments had pledged not to use this power because it likely violates WTO agreements. And then fourth, the President Trump has launched a less well-known, but I think important campaign to change and reform the World Trade Organization, which is the organization, the trade agreement that includes most of the world's countries, about 100 countries around the world. And most specifically, kind of under the radar, he has blocked the appointment of new members of the World Trade Organization Dispute Settlement Appellate Body, which is the most important mechanism in the WTO for resolving disputes between nations. So without a new member, as their terms of the current members expire, the appellate body may not be able to function to resolve trade disputes in the near future. And so President Trump has also said in comments that he would like to reform and change the WTO as well. Okay, so all that is not why you're here. That's just background. That's just to give you background for what, when we talk about President Trump and his trade policy, what is different about it. Those are some of the things that make his trade policy different. So now I'll turn to the experts, our expert speakers today. We are very pleased to be able to bring these two experts on U.S. and international trade policy to this Hofstra Votes event. So first we're going to hear from Professor Raj Bala. I'll introduce him first. And then we'll hear from Mr. Michael Stumo. So let's start with Professor Bala. Professor Bala is a Bredesen Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Kansas. And he's one of the leading scholars, if not the leading scholar, on international trade in the United States and around the world. He's written a treatise, Modern GATT Law, which for trade nerds means that it is the law for most of the trade disputes around the world, which is now in its second edition, and International Trade Law, a textbook. He's also written numerous articles, especially on trade policy. He wrote according to his bio, 8 major pieces on the Doha round of multilateral trade negotiations, which again, you have to be kind of into this to write 8 articles about the Doha round, but there you go. All right, so there's so Professor Bala is a leading expert in international trade law and international trade policy. Michael Stumo is the CEO of the Coalition for a Prosperous America, a national bipartisan organization including agricultural, manufacturing, and organized labor interests. CPA works for policies to balance U.S. trade, create jobs, and achieve prosperity. He works regularly with administration officials on both Democratic and Republican sides. He educates the political, media, and business leaders on issues including trade imbalances, trade enforcement, and other issues related to currency misalignment, other issues related to trade and trade policy. In the past, Michael was also a lawyer and a litigator, as well as general counsel for the Organization for Competitive Markets. So with these two, both speakers are very well versed both in international trade policy in general, but also in the specifics of what's going on currently with the U.S. government and its current trade policy. So we're really a great opportunity to hear from them today. So I'm going to ask each speaker to begin with an opening statement for about 15 minutes to discuss, defend, or critique the features of the Trump trade policy I just described. And then I'm going to sort of exercise my prerogative to ask a few questions, and then we'll have time to open it up to questions from you, the audience, which is the most important thing. So thanks. So we'll begin from hearing from Professor Raj Bala. So thank you.
Thank you to Associate Dean Julian Kuhn, my good friend, and thank you for all coming. You have a remarkable tradition, and I commend you on it at Hofstra, in doing international trade debates. Just before the first presidential debate back in September of 2016, thanks to your Associate Dean, Hofstra hosted a trade panel, and that was very successful, and it was nice to see all of you or your predecessors at that time, so it's great to see you today. And the timing again is impeccable because as Julian said, it was at about 25 minutes before the midnight deadline on Sunday that NAFTA 2.0 was agreed. I am happy to be back also because I really regard myself as a fellow student of trade. Just from the opening remarks that you heard, it's a broad and deep agenda, and there's always lots to learn. Let me start by trying to answer the question. Trade wars usually are not easy to win, but sometimes they may be worth fighting. The Associate Dean has challenged us to try and give an overall assessment, sort of a midterm assessment, midterm exam season, midterm election season. So here it is, a C, a grade of a C, which is somewhere between an A and an F. And what I'm going to do over the next few minutes is go through the 4 levels at which trade is engaged or trade is played. The multilateral level, the regional level, the bilateral level, and then finally the theory that permeates all of the first 3 levels, and give you on the one hand and on the other hand. And for each level, I'll give you some bullet points as to why it looks on the one hand that the trade policy of the United States is trending towards an A. And then on the other hand, I'll give you some bullet points that suggest maybe it's trending towards an F. What I really hope to do, more than anything, is make a stylistic point. That is, not to engage in ad hominem argumentation about the president or about any of his advisors. We've had enough of that, not only in trade law and policy, but throughout public life. I'm trying to focus as much as possible just on the substance. I will say something about negotiating style towards the end when because I think it does impinge a little bit on the administration's stated goals, but otherwise I'm going to stay off of personalities. Starting with the multilateral level, that is the World Trade Organization and its 164 members. On the one hand, I think the administration was smart to declare in March 2018 that the United States no longer will participate in Doha round negotiations. The Doha round negotiations effectively died in December 2008. The Chilean president in about 2012 said they were dead. Finally, the United States recognized that reality. I think also the administration made a good move in staying in the fishing negotiations. Now that may sound like a really obscure topic, fishing subsidies, but about 85% of the world's fishing stocks are depleted. They're a crucial source of protein for millions, hundreds of millions around the world, and they're also a crucial source of livelihood for small fishermen in India, for example. And we are staying in the negotiations to deal with illegal, unreported, and unregulated, or IUU fishing that's going on, thanks partly to overfishing by the likes of China. On the other hand, the blockage of the appellate body candidates is potentially going to destroy what is well regarded as the crown jewel of the of the multilateral system, and that's dispute settlement. And the blockage is really based on a false pretense. It's based on the idea that judges, whether they're at the Supreme Court level or whether they're at the WTO level, are basically mechanical robots that simply just take a word and then they can apply it without any interpretation possible. And all of us, all 3 of us, can give you examples from the GATT WTO text. Less than fair value, what's fair? Or only if necessary, what's necessary? Where the appellate body judges have to step in and do some interpretation. To be sure, it's reasonable to argue whether or not they sometimes overstep their bounds. But holding up the entire appellate body, when you've got many of the 164 countries deeply interested in seeing their disputes resolved, is a little bit far. The other thing I would say, on the other hand, is the resistance to dealing with special and differential treatment. Since going back to a Haberler report in the 1950s and ultimately a change in the GATT in 1966, we have had a principle of special and differential treatment in the multilateral trading system to recognize developed from developing, from least developed countries. And that principle is really under attack, principally by the United States. And when 80% of the membership of the WTO is developing or least developed, I'm not sure that's going to get us very far. At the regional level, by which I mean free trade agreements, on the one hand, the NAFTA 2.0 completion is a substantive achievement. For example, the auto rules of origin for the first time create not only the highest level of regional value content, going from 62.5% to 75%, but they also, for the first time, have a minimum wage test that 40 to 45% of a vehicle has to be made with labor at $16 an hour or more. And for people who are worried about wage stagnation, or people who are worried from middle class and lower middle class families about having enough income, that might not be a bad move. The administration also dropped its opposition to the Chapter 19 anti-dumping and countervailing duty panels, dropped its opposition dropped its advocacy of a 5-year sunset rule. Good moves. But I'll tell you a couple of others that have not gotten as much attention, which to commend the administration. One is they did concede to Prime Minister Trudeau the cultural industries exemption. Showed a bit of empathy that the Canadians do feel an onslaught from Hollywood and other, entertainment and media entertainment industries in the United States, and they want to protect their Francophone and First Nations people's culture. The other one, which unfortunately has not gotten any attention, except in one interview I did for the Lawrence Journal World. If you look in NAFTA, the new NAFTA, you will see for the first time a provision that requires countries to implement policies to protect women, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities, and people who are questioning their gender identity from discrimination in the marketplace, from discrimination in employment. In other words, for the first time in a trade agreement that the U.S. has entered into, we have a provision that protects, or is designed to protect, women in the LGBTQ plus community from discrimination in the workplace. So that was not championed by the United States, that was championed by Prime Minister Trudeau, but the U.S. agreed to it. We also have a rule dealing with China and entering into free trade agreements with non-market economies. Those are all, on the one hand, trending towards an A. On the other hand, as the Associate Dean, as Julian said, the withdrawal from TPP, in my humble opinion, was a catastrophic blunder. It stands to reason that an FTA with 3 countries versus an FTA with the same 3 countries plus 9 others, including Japan, the third or fourth largest economy in the world, including Vietnam, one of the most important emerging markets, that the second FTA is going to be better economically in terms of classic Ricardian production and consumption benefits. It further stands to reason, especially when the FTAs are pretty broadly similar on terms. There's some differences at the margins, but they're pretty broadly similar. It also stands to reason that the TPP was better because it had a national security dimension which NAFTA cannot match. And that was about containing China. No question about that. That was an underlying impulse from the national security establishment about dealing with China's ostensibly peaceful rise in the Asia Pacific. And we've seen how ostensible it is. Just this week, our warships had a confrontation again in the 9-dash line area. And also, on the other hand, the chorus, the Korea-US FTA, that really is so minor. The terms of renegotiation are so minor that they're not even going to need approval from Congress. Extending by 20 years the duty-free entry of trucks and SUVs from Korea, that's not a huge deal. And likewise, I'm not even sure that raising the quota for American cars going into Korea that do not meet Korean environmental standards is good for the air that the Koreans breathe. Now coming to the bilateral level. On the one hand, trending towards an A. Section 301. This is a trade war worth fighting. And I'll give you just one anecdote to suggest why personally, I think the reports that have come out from the USTR and the White House concerning China are spot on correct, and they're well documented. Take a well-known company, John Deere. John Deere went into China and they made tractors and harvesters. And this is going back 10, 15 years, 15 years ago. And within a few months, a few blocks away from John Deere's factory, starts coming out from another assembly line, tractors, harvesters, and they have the same green paint, green and yellow paint. It doesn't say John Deere, it's got Mandarin characters. What had been done was John Deere's equipment was reverse engineered and then reproduced a few blocks away. Being a good corporate citizen in its locality, John Deere went to the courts in China and sued for IP infringement. And it won 10 years later. 10 years later, the horse is out of the barn, right? They've lost the IP, they've lost the profits. Company after company, service industry after service industry can tell you stories like that. And that's before we even get into the issue of cyber attacks. And this is a concern that's shared by the EU, by India. This is where we actually have a common bond with many of our friends and allies around the world. This is not a trade war that's going to end anytime soon, because the two sides perceive each other as an existential threat. From the perspective of the Americans, we are saying, rightly I think, that our future economic, indeed national security, depends on the protection of IP, which has a military dimension to it. We can't continue to see it compromised. That's where our growth, that's where our strength is going to lie. From the Chinese perspective, their goal in their Made in China 2025 industrial policy is to get to an advanced manufacturing state by 2025. They have specific market share targets. For example, back to John Deere, 95% of all farm equipment would have to be used by Chinese farmers, would be made domestically. Well, to get there, you got to steal it, right? And that's a real problem. And remember this is nothing of the bargain that the Chinese Communist Party has with its people. We will assure that you succeed economically, that you have the space to get rich, but leave the politics to us. Now, the way that bargain is implemented by the party is now infringing on our existentially important IP. So that's why I say this is going to go on for a while. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, the 232 investigations on steel and aluminum, look, the Defense Department was against them. They said, we only get about 4% of our steel from China. Our steel and aluminum come from 100 different countries. Most of them are friends and allies. And yet, the administration pushed ahead, notwithstanding the comments from the Pentagon, from the Secretary of Defense indeed, saying we're going to go forward with this. And now we're threatening tariffs on 232 tariffs on autos and auto parts. The point is, if you look at the Section 232 statute, which is in our Trade Act of 1962, I'm not sure the administration has made a good case that the imports of the steel, the aluminum, the autos, the auto parts, the uranium, are impairing our national security. Because you can take the view that we've got to do all that domestically, or you can take the view that it's actually the interdependence with our friends and allies that makes us more secure. On the other hand, at the bilateral level, Iran sanctions. November 5th, midnight, November 6th, you'll see the final full range of Iran sanctions be put in place. We all know that the backdrop is the withdrawal from the nuclear deal. I'm happy to defend that deal if that comes up in questions and answers. I think it was a mistake to pull out of it. And now we are isolating Iran all the further. and making ourselves more OPEC dependent to ensure that OPEC continues to pump out oil and fill the supply gap you're going to see in about a month. Finally, the fourth level, the theory. On the one hand, trending towards an A. I think the administration has made it very clear, and I think a lot of academics, I know a lot of academics didn't really get this, that trade and national security are inextricably linked. They have been inextricably linked since Plutarch and Horace were debating trade thousands of years ago. And I think they've made a good case that the foundation of national security is a strong domestic economy. And we've learned the lessons from the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had a weak core. On the other hand, and this is where we get into the style point, without being ad hominem, the administration has alienated our closest friends and allies through its rhetoric. And there's no need to do that. I was interested to see how mightily the Canadians were trying to respond politely to much of the rhetoric that was coming out. And then also, on the other hand, sort of trending downwards is, and this is where I'm definitely turning it over to our next speaker, there has to be a clear case made about the effects of trade deficits and currency manipulation on how that undermines our domestic economy and therefore our national security. I'm not saying that case can't be made. I don't think it's been made clearly to the public yet. So overall, it's a C. It's just a midterm. Things can get better, as we all know, through the rest of the semester or the next 2 years. But thank you for the opportunity to give these remarks.
Thank you so much, Professor Bala. Very appreciate it. Now we'll hear from Michael. Michael, thank you.
So I did go to the University of Iowa Law School, which is the #2 law school in the country, second only to Hofstra. Little more on my organization. It'll help you understand where I'm coming from a bit. As Julian said, we are a coalition of agriculture, manufacturing, and organized labor. An odd cast of characters. My board and my membership range from the very hard left to the hard right and everything in between, because trade doesn't cut cleanly down party lines in Washington or in the country. And so during the Trump-Hillary campaign and the run-up, it was pretty interesting. We had our chairman who was helping Trump campaign. He's a former steel company executive. We had AFL-CIO, which is helping Hillary. We had Bernie supporters before he was out, and the like. Still do. But our organization has been, we were founded in 2007. We're concerned about U.S. trade deficits, the deindustrialization of America, the moving of our industrial base and agricultural base to other countries, and the job implications. And so we've been largely supportive of the Trump trade team, Trade Ambassador Bob Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative. I know him, I know his team. Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, acquainted with him. Peter Navarro, the Office of the White House Advisor on Trade and Manufacturing Policy, know him as well. And AFL-CIO, Teamsters Union, they're largely supportive of the trade agenda, as well as our family farm and ranch groups. So that being said, pulling out of the TPP was an excellent decision. It was a silly agreement. In our view, it had nothing to do with China. China wasn't even mentioned in it. It was all about providing other countries further access to the U.S. market and therefore displacing U.S. industry in our own market, and we get insufficient export opportunities to offset it. the 201 tariffs, which were imposed in January on clothes washers and solar panels, were about South Korean subsidized clothes washers. The Obama administration had put tariffs on clothes washers, subsidized LG and Samsung clothes washers. I actually own an LG clothes washer and dryer. And it didn't work because they kept transshipping through other countries, right? There's a major industry. I get emails all the time. Hey, we've got these from Chinese, or mostly Chinese. There's these tariffs, but we know how to transship. We can label and send through third countries, and we can get around it. Solar panels too, massive subsidies on solar panels. The Obama administration put a lot of tariffs on. Country specific, but it's whack-a-mole, right? You can't catch them. So they did it against all the world to keep it from coming in from all countries. Those are temporary. The 232 tariffs, which are under Section 232, the 1962 Trade Expansion Act on steel and aluminum. Tariff Armageddon was predicted. On Twitter, a lot of the global trade press follows me, and I joust with them, and I say, where's the tariff Armageddon? 25% tariffs on incoming steel. So among all the major, China has made steel a national security issue. It's part of one of their 5-year plans. It was going to succeed. They're the source of most of the overcapacity in the world. It's massive. You see the charts. It's amazing what they've done. When China decides to do something, it's really big. It's bigger than when Germany does it. It's bigger than when Italy does it. It's just massive, right? And it's a flood. The EU has made steel a priority. Turkey, Brazil, Japan, Korea, all these countries have made steel and aluminum a priority. And among them all, none of them had a China steel overcapacity problem. Obama and Bush had put tariffs on Chinese incoming steel for being subsidized, but again, it was whack-a-mole, whack-a-mole. You couldn't catch up. It kept flowing in, transshipped through Canada and the like. And so the 232 tariffs were against all countries because the issue was that our steel industry was cratering. Our aluminum industry was almost nearly gone. And the view is this is a foundation of an industrial supply chain that is dual use, civilian and military, and it's economically important too. And so we put it up. The reason the allies say, well, we're your allies. How can you say national security? It isn't about if you're an ally or not. It's about our national security and preserving a core industry that's the foundation for aerospace, for automotive, for our defense manufacturing system. Now you can say, well, it's not national defense, it's not national security because of what Raj said. But what it is, and we know from World War II, and a lot of my membership that are manufacturers, it's a dual-use supply chain. You cannot have an industry that is that is viable, that has the capacity and the scale to be a top-tier cutting-edge industry unless you have both civilian and military demand happening. So the Soviet Union already tried that. They tried to build industry with only defense demand, and that failed. So you'll see the dual-use nature is really the core of the administration's case, and we're now seeing that industry come back. And I have a lot of members who are concerned who are steel buyers, but they're actually doing really quite well. They're getting more business, more hiring. They're raising wages and the like. And we did a study showing that despite the predictions of lots of job losses, which if you're in this field, and I know I'm trying to not be so inside baseball because I just live this stuff, but there's 288,000 jobs predicted to be lost from those tariffs. They weren't. It didn't happen. Everyone predicted. You look at CNBC, you look at the economic models, it didn't happen. We've documented 541 jobs that were lost and 11,500 that were created. You know, in an economy that produces 200,000 jobs a month, small beans, but we didn't have 288,000 lost. So we're seeing a lot of the free trade models and theories are proving not true. Now we have the China tariffs coming in under Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act which gives the president authority to take action against other countries who are violating international laws. In this case, China was engaging in the most massive, persistent, state-directed commercial espionage campaign in the history of the world. If you look at Bloomberg today, there's a major story on Chinese subcontractor manufacturers putting little tiny microchips and motherboards that are going into defense and in many sectors, including defense. And it's not like it's like a worm or something where you can like fish it out with software. It's hardware in there, and it's really serious. So in Bloomberg today, but the administration documented, and nobody rebuts this. The Democrats who oppose Trump for all kinds of reasons they say, yeah, China's a problem. The New York Times, who wasn't on board, yeah, China's a problem. They say, well, you shouldn't do this with tariffs. They don't have another solution. But so the 301, they documented 36 methods, patterns, and practices that the Communist Party of China used to steal technology from the U.S. or otherwise acquire in gray area theft. You cannot, in many cases, sell in China unless you manufacture there. That's their forced localization. Think of the reciprocal if we impose this on incoming companies, right? You cannot manufacture there unless you joint venture with a state-owned or state-influenced company. In some industries, you can't joint venture with a state-influenced company unless you bring interesting technology. Because if you don't bring interesting technology, we don't want you, right? So, and when you do get your joint venture, if you get that far, then you have to have a branch of the local Communist Party of China in the management of your company. So imagine if we did that here. So it's hard to see a settlement from it. I saw an NPR interview of the Chinese ambassador to the WTO today. If you look at NPR, odd that it was about 301 tariffs and never mentioned commercial espionage. They say, well, when is it going to be settled? So China has never, although it's unanimous opinion here that it's established the commercial espionage, and the 301 tariffs are designed to change behavior. Just like WTO authorized tariffs against unlawful subsidies are designed to change behavior. So in that sense, it's nothing new. Again, Obama, Bush did their own tariffs, but they were more narrow on countries and they didn't work because of whack-a-mole, right? But they're all designed to change behavior. So China has not said, oh yes, we are doing this commercial espionage is a real bad thing, and we promise to stop. They've never admitted that that's wrong, and instead they retaliate against fairly traded goods. So we started with 25% tariffs on 50 billion in Chinese imports, then recently gone to 200 after they failed to change, so they're up. They retaliated against us, so Trump is upping it to 200 billion through a process. First at 10%, now it's going to go up to 25% in January. Now understand, we import last year 505 billion from China. We export 130 billion. All right, so they've tariffed a good part of the 130. We're at about half of the 505. They're running out of road. Trump is now ordered to go to the next 267 billion to basically cover it with China. So with the steel and aluminum tariffs, as far as consumer impact, it hasn't happened. There's no inflation. Import prices are about the same. It just hasn't happened. We've got 3.9% unemployment. We've got nearly 4% growth. It hasn't happened. We'll see as these China tariffs bite more what happens in terms of consumer price inflation and the like. But we do know that other countries like China, Japan, South Korea that have used tariffs to protect their industry, Germany that have used currency devaluation to also protect their industry and to subsidize their exports, and to use other industrial strategies to promote their own rather than pursue cheap goods overseas. Those are the countries that have grown, as we have declined from the 50% of the world economy after World War II to about 22% now. So trade wars are easy to win. I give Trump probably an A- right now, maybe a B+, because really are changing the nature of the game from a fictional free trade mindset, which doesn't exist, which cannot exist. It's a pink unicorn that people like to write about. But tariffs are like less than 10% of the issue. You've got exchange rates, you've got subsidies, you've got non-tariff barriers, and you have macroeconomic differences such as wage levels, such as interest rates, such as consumption and production trends and the like, and tariffs are a small part of it. So it cannot exist unless you are free trade within the United States. For example, among the states we have a common labor market, a common banking, a common currency, a common fiscal policy, etc. But between countries you can't get it. So trade wars are also easy to win if you're the United States, because we are the biggest economy in the world still. We're the consumer of last resort. Nobody fights really hard to get into Malaysia's market because they don't have enough money to be a big market for your goods. We are the buyer. In the last 40 years we've been the buyer of last resort, and having that status gives you enormous market power, which you can use to condition access to your market upon others playing by the rules. You can abuse that position or not, but that's where the power lies. We as lawyers focus on the rule of law and what should be around it, but the law follows where the market power goes. Okay? Now, the U.S. has a long history. Trump, is he a protectionist or an isolationist? Really, the trade team is dominated by Hamiltonians, sort of modern-day Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was the father of the American system of economics, which rejected the cosmopolitan economists like Adam Smith. So the tariff and trade, strategic trade, not fair trade, not free trade, but strategic trade system of the American system of economics has a long history. It dominated the first 130 years of our economy. You probably know from the Constitution that Article 1, Section 8 gave Congress the right to collect tariffs. That's who has it. If the tariffs were horrible, we wouldn't have it in the Constitution. George Washington, in his first address to Congress, said a free people should promote such manufactories as to render them independent of others for essential, particularly military supplies. The second act of Congress, not the first, not the third, but the second, was a tariff bill which was necessary for the encouragement and protection of manufacturers. Now, they could have said back in the day, you know what, we can get really cheap stuff from Europe. Why build our own? It's really expensive to build our own. We can get that cheap stuff. But they were worried that the manufacturing superpower of the day, Great Britain, the workshop of the world, that they would be, who they just had a war for independence with, that they would be forever remain a banana republic, providing commodities to the industrial powers of Europe, including Great Britain. And so Britain's lead would then be entrenched. So they actually taxed consumption in the form of tariffs to build their own industry. And that worked pretty well, because by 1870 or 1880 they had gone from being a war-torn agrarian nation to the biggest economy in the world, deposing Great Britain. Germany did the same in the German Federation of 1830. Frederick List, the German economist, followed Alexander Hamilton. Germany also was worried about being forever relegated to colony status, essentially, or banana republic status in relation to Great Britain. Instead, they did free trade among the German states and strategic trade with Britain with tariffs or with the rest of the world. Fast forward to Japan, they used tariffs, currency devaluation, and industrial subsidies to take that cold, windswept northern Pacific island into ultimately becoming the second biggest economy in the world. South Korea did the same after the Korean War with tariffs, currency devaluation, and the like. China did it starting in 1994 with tariffs, currency devaluation, a series of 5-year plans to keep out other industries, build their own. And they were pretty successful and dragged hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, more than we've ever seen in the entire history of the world, to their credit. Of course, they did it off the back of the U.S. consumer. The point is that no country, every country in the world that has gone from poor to rich has done so through some version of the American system of economics, adapted to themselves. There are no countries that went from poor to rich through free trade. Now, if you look at the imbalances of this day, the U.S. is the biggest trade deficit country in the world. We have China overproducing and underconsuming, and they have overcapacity to sell. Ditto Japan, ditto South Korea, ditto Germany and the EU. Who absorbs their overcapacity because they produce more than they consume, employing their people with wages, and it's a great gig if you can get it, right? And then you rely on foreign consumers for growth to absorb your overcapacity. And we've been absorbing that for about 40 years, okay? And we've been deindustrializing as a result, and our wages have stagnated and job quality has gone down. So we're more in the gig economy now, which sounds really cool until you start doing $15 or $18 an hour jobs at 30 hours a week. Now, I want to for trade, the best way, most of what you hear about trade is wrong in the press. There's a collective insanity. You think of it in 3 tiers as to the effect of the tariffs and other things you hear. The top tier is global volume of trade. How much trade is happening in the world? That's purely a function of whether countries are growing or shrinking. Are they producing things or not, and they trade it. Tariffs make no difference on the global volume of trade. The balance of trade among countries, tariffs make no difference either. And I didn't believe that 2 years ago, but I've been waterboarded with the facts. And if you look at high and low tariffs around countries around the world, you can find no relationship whether they have a surplus or a deficit. Okay? What matters is exchange rates. Are you overvalued or under? That's why China, Switzerland, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan devalue their currency because it makes their exports a lot cheaper. It makes their imports more expensive, protecting your industry. It is the mother of all tariffs. It is the mother of all subsidies. And exchange rates, if you look in the economics textbooks, are supposed to adjust in order to get to balanced trade, because if you're a surplus country, you're growing fast, your currency will go up, making your exports more expensive, you'll sell less, and you'll trend toward balance. That simply isn't happening, but exchange rates are the big explainer there. And that's why one big critique I have of the administration is they haven't gotten to the exchange rate adjustment mechanism, which is driving our 42-year trade deficit the most. The third tier, after volume of trade and balance of trade, is composition of trade. What do you tend to produce or sell or buy? Turnips, potatoes, semiconductors, automobiles, and the like. That's where tariffs can make a difference. So as we have the steel and aluminum tariffs, we're going to get less steel and aluminum, but we'll have more of something else. It's your God-given Ricardian sort of superiority, comparative advantage given by God, as Ricardo said, or it's your technologically created comparative advantage, or it's your industrial subsidies, or your other strategies and the like that are the composition of trade. So think of something called Dutch disease, where the Dutch discovered oil some time back, and you think, wow, they're going to sell all this oil, they're going to have a trade surplus. But they didn't. What happened, they sold the oil, brought in a lot of foreign currency, their economy kind of, their currency went up, and it made their manufacturing and agricultural goods less competitive. So it's a squeezing of the, like squeezing a balloon. So that's the composition of trade issue. So that's where tariffs are going to happen. That's why you see we're getting more and more tariffs this year, and we submitted a report to the administration last week that, look, you're seeing a trade deficit increase from last year by 8 to 10% more than last year. You have all these tariffs, and it's because of the dollar. If you watch the last 6 months, the dollar's appreciated about 8% against world currencies, and it's sucking in more imported goods and making exports less competitive. And I told White House staff 2 weeks ago, I said, at the end of the year, the boss is going to say, hey, we did this aggressive tariff action, worse more than we've seen in years, and I got a trade deficit that's 8 to 10% higher. What's going on? I said, the exchange rate issue explains it, and he's going to have to decide whether to do something about it. Lastly, and actually Europe is now the biggest overcapacity economic zone in the world, with a surplus of $442 billion that they're offloading on others, including us. Lastly, the U.S.-China game is in true, and I've been to Germany twice. Germans call me over there and say, explain Trump trade to us. We don't like it. We don't know what's going on. And I said, you know, the imbalances, but also the U.S.-China game is a game of great powers. China has designs on being a regional and perhaps global superpower. They're a 3,000-year-old culture. We were born last week. They play the long game, but they're going to be the biggest economy in the world in 10 to 15 years, and then more, and can make a bid for, again, regional or global superpower status. And those are messy in history. Superpower transitions are messy. The U.S. thinks, you know, and I think anyway, that we're better at it than they are. We made a lot of mistakes, but we'd rather keep that status as opposed to China. They may have other ideas. The Germans thought, yeah, we'd rather have the U.S. do it because the Chinese don't share our values. So there is a superpower rivalry game, and you'll probably see, I think, more of a decoupling from China, which is really a big deal. I think these next bit of tariffs are going to go into effect next year. You see tariffs on everything Chinese. You see the national security risks, you see the economic security risks, you see the great power rivalry, and I think that's a long game. It's not, well, we're going to settle pretty soon. I could be wrong. I'm not speaking for the administration, but I think it's reasonable that we'll see a decoupling and an isolation, walling off a little bit of the China economy. We'll be doing more deals with other allies. And the walling off is up to us because we're the only country they have major surpluses with where we absorb their overcapacity. If we quit that job, they don't have anywhere else to go. So I went a little bit long, but I think it's worth saying what I did. So thank you.
Excuse me. All right. Thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate it. Those are really helpful and useful comments. And one of my goals in bringing these two great speakers here is to, although they agree on some things, they don't agree on everything. In fact, there are some issues they disagree on. I think that's an important part of this whole Hofstra votes sort of theory, is how we present viewpoints that are different and viewpoints that are engaging with each other. I am going to just, before I turn it over to you for some questions, I just have one question for each of the of our speakers. So first, a question for Raj. So it sounds like, I mean, Raj, that sort of just it seems like that there is a real problem with the free trade consensus in delivering. What is the ideal situation for you if the U.S. would respond, if you agree with Michael that China is sort of an unfair trader in various ways, which sounds like you guys agree on that point, then what would be your ideal response to the United States that's different from what has been adopted by the administration? Is it just that we needed something like TPP, or is there something more than that needs to be done?
Well, I'm not sure if I have a short answer to that. In terms of what's likely to be done, sometime in the next few to several months, we'll see the fourth wave of U.S. Section 301 tariffs go on. So the full range of Chinese merchandise, all roughly 10,000 products in the harmonized tariff system, will be covered, and that's all, 517 billion merchandise from China will be tariffed. That may finally bring the Chinese government to speak seriously about the complaints that the U.S. has made. That's a possibility.
Do you think that's a good way to go about it? Or, do you agree that's
I'm not sure that we have a lot of other options right now at our disposal, because we have been talking to them for over a decade. We've pursued claims at the WTO against China on matters that are within the WTO's subject matter jurisdiction. We're left with our weapon, which is unilateral retaliation. Or to put it differently, as I put in a Bloomberg column, this is probably a just war to fight.
Okay, actually, so I picked the one area we all agree, or the two of you agree on, which is, it sounds like the get tough with China line seems to be working across. And just a quick question, I do want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience. So a question for you, Michael. I guess just it's more of a theoretical question. So the United States has had a huge advantage because it's a big country, big population, has free trade within its borders. So, and I think economic theory is correct. I don't know if you disagree that at least if within the the bigger the country, the bigger the free trade benefits. If you think of free trade among the states, like we're better off that we can trade between New York and New Jersey than if we, separate trade policies for each state. So then is the problem then not so much economic but political, that the world can't be as orderly as a single country in its internal workings? And if that's true, then would you support, a free trade policy that worked with like-minded countries, like say Canada and Europe and Japan, in ways that sort of try to replicate as closely as possible some of the advantages that we reap from free trade within the United States, so sort of free trade among countries that are broadly similar economically and politically and such?
No.
Oh.
So,
like if we could just annex Canada, wouldn't that be good? Like wouldn't that be good? And maybe bring along a few other countries as well, England or something.
so right. So it's really a fascinating question of there's an irreducible complexity to a nation state. The EU is facing some real hurdles because they've only got a union with free movement of goods and services, people, and a currency union. They don't have a fiscal union, a banking union, a regulatory union, and the like. And it's breaking them apart because you get these imbalances. When I was in Germany, they said, well, you have free trade among the states. Why is it different here? And it's actually pretty clear. There's not a lot of disagreement on this point that you do, as I said, have an irreducible complexity to having the whole bit. You really need to get to the nation state. If we have New York is prospering, Alabama is not. We don't do sort of a lurching, moralizing bank bailout, debt bailout of Alabama like they do with Greece. We have consistent fiscal transfers to keep things sort of in balance across the country. What's less known is that the 12 Federal Reserve banks get imbalances. One has, surpluses. Others have deficit on their sheets, and every quarter or so they just quietly true everything up. They can't do that in Europe. So in Europe, you've got Germany, as I said, is a strong economy hiding behind a weak currency. What's happened there is it was a great deal for Germany to buy into the euro and get rid of the Deutschmark at a pretty good, they traded it in at an advantageous rate, all of a sudden which was devalued, and they became much more productive, but the other parts of Europe pulled the euro value down. So Germany has the biggest trade surplus in the world right now at 8.5% of GDP. It's massive. They're worse than China in that regard. And they are collecting all the manufacturing in Germany. And the Deutschmark isn't adjusting to make German goods more expensive. And so the euro is dragging, they're exporting their overcapacity to peripheral Europe, the PIGS countries, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. And so now German unemployment is about 3.5% or 4%, and Italy and Spain are at about 11 or 12%, and they want to get out. And you've got to have, if they were the United States, or if they were the United States of Europe, so to speak, they would be using fiscal transfers and a common policy to true up all these imbalances going on. But they're not. And I was at Frankfurt, 3 weeks ago, and talking to the German American Business Club of Frankfurt, and I laid this out, and I asked them as they were living it, I said, does anybody in this room think the Eurozone can survive for 20 years with only a currency union? And nobody raised their hand. And I've had that with other people too. So you really need to have it. When we did the NAFTA, what's driving the Mexican trade imbalance? When we did the NAFTA, Mexico was kind of coming up and doing pretty well, but all of a sudden they crashed. The Mexican peso, they had a peso crisis in '94. It devalued the peso by 50%, made everything Mexican 50% cheaper than it was the day before. Everything the U.S. to send to them was 50% more expensive. And then you have Mexico being the third biggest trade. They never recovered. And so that's really what was driving our imbalance there.
So and one more question, and actually for each of you. This is mostly for Michael. I think your suggestion is every country looks out for its own interests in sort of selfish ways. And the United States has not been perhaps selfish enough in some ways in protecting its economic interests and trade. Maybe that's mischaracterizing it. But isn't the theory that we need some sort of global mechanism to get these, because if every country acts in this narrow, self-interested way, wouldn't we then have less free trade and less overall economic growth? Not thinking about it from the perspective of one country, but if the U.S. adopts these policies, it might benefit the United States, but does the world as a whole benefit? Or should we care about that? And I'm curious actually what Raj thinks, but let me ask you first.
We've actually been thinking in our group a lot about what, if we didn't have the WTO, what? And you could say, so the one problem with the WTO, the imbalances are something that people poo-poo, and they, the Germans say, oh, imbalances don't matter. And then I ask them, well, you got the 8.5% surplus, why don't you try an 8.5% deficit? Well, they didn't want to do that. They didn't, I asked them, why, do you want the job of absorbing steel or the global overcapacity? No, they didn't want to do that. So it matters when they would be faced with it. The WTO rules are blind to imbalances. The nirvana globally is relative balance of trade. And Michael Pettis, a professor of economics, he's a Carnegie fellow. He wrote the book The Great Rebalancing, and he writes it the best. It's really good. And so that's a major. Nothing in the WTO. The WTO is blind to imbalances. There are technical rules and this subsidy or that subsidy or something, but they don't get into the imbalances. The IMF does, but they have no enforcement. The IMF duty is to avoid competitive devaluation of your currency, to get to balance, to have the exchange rate mechanism work, but there's no enforcement. Plus, and it's a consensus-based body, and the wrongdoers block consensus. So you theoretically could. Now let's say, what would a world look like if we didn't have the global institutions? And indeed, some describe the game, the great competition among nations is the competition for good jobs and industries. And certainly Germany plays that game. Certainly Japan, Korea, China, Singapore, Taiwan, a lot of these countries do that game. They are not necessarily global humanitarian citizens, citizen of the world, kind of a view of things at all. We're expected to be that. Maybe, and as I said, tariffs really don't matter for volume of trade or balance of trade. It's more composition of trade. And so it's a hard lesson to unlearn. But even the Peterson Institute of International Economics, which is the great globalist think tank in Washington, agrees with what I just said. So it's not some weird protectionist position, okay? So maybe it would just be some Nash equilibrium, some game theory Nash equilibrium that would result where the next move you make might be a move where you get another move back that you don't like. So there's sort of a jousting and you get to some Nash equilibrium. I don't know, but we've actually thought about that.
I think the WTO plays an indispensable role in each of its functions even today. I mean, the first is its negotiating function. It's a forum for negotiations. And it is, as I mentioned, proceeding with at least some mid-level, either multilateral or plurilateral deals. Its second function, while it's currently inhibited dispute settlement, again, there's no alternative in the trade world to that. If the alternative is sort of the Melian dialogue, the strong will do what they do and the weak will suffer what they must. On its third function, trade policy review, again, we don't have a multilateral organization that reviews periodically, every 3 to 6 years basically, the WTO, the trade policies of each of the member countries. And then finally, I think it's an important source of research and statistics. It does produce useful studies. And then I think from the business community's perspective, as you probably have heard the statistic, 95% of the customers of American companies are outside the United States. And if you look at the changing composition of where the most populous countries are in 1950 to 2050, they are all developing countries. The U.S. engages or not with the developing world through the WTO. So I think it's a very important forum.
Okay, so I want to open this up to questions from the audience. So if anyone would like to ask a question, can you please raise your hand and try to speak as loudly so you can hear. Thank you. Go ahead.
When we began, Professor Q told us that we should buy our Mercedes now. Well, what about the person who needs to buy a refrigerator? So what I want to ask about is the effect of these tariffs on consumers. And if consumers have a hard time because lots of things they want to buy are more expensive, doesn't that have an effect not only on these individual consumers, but on our economy?
You want to help show us?
Whoever.
Sure. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So take the individual consumption decision first. The consumer, when faced with rising prices of any good or service, has the choice, if they are willing and able to purchase, to go forward with the purchase. That means that they're on the demand curve above the new equilibrium point, basically. If they're not, the second alternative is they're knocked out of the market. They can't make that purchase. Or third, they may have to defer it. Or fourth, buy used. You could expect the used car market to do better in the future. And then, as you point out also, in an aggregate sense, with an expected diminution of individual consumption, we would expect the aggregate demand curve to shift in, because consumption is about 70% of overall GDP. So you're absolutely right. I think that's an important point to think about. Multiplied by higher Fed interest rates.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Right, so across the economy, economists try to say, oh, the consumer price is going to rise. When they say that, that's untrue in the full sense, because each product has its own supply and demand curve, which means that in some cases there will be zero pass-through to the consumer. We've actually seen that with steel and aluminum. You cannot detect a pass-through price to the consumer. In other cases, it could be passed on all the way. We haven't had a tariff yet that's done that. In most cases, it will be in the middle. If gas prices have gone up much more than any other impact we've seen with tariffs this year, it's a much bigger impact on consumers, so are the interest rate hikes. And in the past, when we've seen those things happen, we haven't seen a crash in consumption. So I made the case earlier that tariff Armageddon is going to be proven to be false, and it has so far. The bigger test is going to be as we see more tariffs on finished goods that are coming from China. I know from my members who are more of intermediate goods suppliers, they've seen a lot of business coming back. So if you assume, so there could be one thing, the Chinese will just eat the tariffs, or in some cases they pass them on. But in a lot of cases there are other alternatives. They move to third countries that are not China. That's happening. And that means you won't have like a full 10 or 25% pass through. And in many cases they're moving back to the US. This is a whole mix, but this is the big test now of how much pass through there are. We've got the economic models, and we're finding out that the models predict a pass through to consumers that we're not actually seeing, and we're trying to figure out how to hack these models to make them represent the reality. But again, as Professor Michael Pettis said, I mentioned his book before, the reason for trade intervention is that while you tax consumers to some extent, you get more benefit out of productive capacity and aggregate wages across the country than the tax. And that's the game that, as I said, China, Korea, Germany, and the like have done. They've taxed their consumers, but they got a bigger benefit economy-wide, and they're doing better than us in a trend line.
Okay, next question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, would you all agree that China is indeed a bad actor?
I'm not sure we all agree with the two, though, yes. Okay.
With regard to that point, it's been going on for decades. Companies like GM, companies like Apple, companies like PepsiCo, been chopping at the bit to go to China to sell their products and also to have their products manufactured there cheaply and shipped back to the U.S. Knowing that full well that the restrictions were unfair that would be placed on them, knowing that there's possibility of intellectual property theft, all of a sudden now we're into this tariff mode. And the question becomes, what kind of hurt is that going to do to these companies on a long-term basis, if any?
Right, so I mean, I think this is just a variation of this. I mean, they went into China knowing, right? They didn't go in blind. So, you know, what's going to happen to them now that we're going to start this war with China, or trade war with China? If you want to start, Raj.
It depends. I think it depends on the company and its position in the supply chain, and a very detailed point which we haven't spoken about, and that is whether or not, if it needs it, it's getting an exclusion or an exemption from either the 232 or the 301 tariffs. There are thousands of petitions now in front of the Commerce Department on the 232 tariffs and the USTR on the 301 tariffs, where companies are asking. I was just working on one last night with my firm, Denton's, that they're going to lose half of their workforce in Texas, a family company, if they don't get the petition that they have made to get exempt. So it's sort of very case specific to answer how it's going to affect them. Others will have the agility to move production facilities, say, to Vietnam or possibly even India, and can no longer need to worry about supplying through China. It really depends on their market position.
Right, you're going to see a lot move out of China. It depends on the industry, but on net, it's going to move out of China. There's a groupthink that happened among corporate CEOs and procurement people, procurement managers, that the future is about China moving and offshoring to China. You know, there was these, and CEOs wanted to say in their quarterly reports to shareholders, hey, we're in China, we got access to this, 1.3 or whatever billion potential consumers. That's changing. It's becoming very uncertain. It's very unfriendly. The businessmen themselves are saying it, and the examples of the theft, of the harassment, of that sort of thing they're just accumulating, and the groupthink is changing. It's like steering a battleship, but that groupthink is changing. And plus the fact is they just don't get more than a 3 to 5 year runway to sell there before they're run out by theft of their property, the competition by state and influence enterprises and the like. And they're figuring out that it's really not a big nation of consumers, it's a big nation of producers. It's a glut of labor coming on board that produce more than they consume. And so the phrase that we hear, 95% of consumers live outside the U.S., well, 95% of producers live outside the U.S. too. 4 billion of them make less than $10 a day. So the nature of it is we've got global overcapacity of labor, of capital, and production coming online, and they're looking to the U.S. to absorb that and to provide rising living standards elsewhere.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, on the back, yes.
So earlier, Professor, you said that the Trans-Pacific Partnership was one of the biggest deals the U.S. ever did be a part of. I just want to know your thoughts and, I guess in defense of it, the gross allegations that the problems arises, especially giving multinational corporations huge legal power to sue developing countries and hurt their progress, protecting the environment, workers' wages, and public health.
So the TPP wasn't a perfect agreement. A couple of points about that. First, at the time the U.S. Signed the TPP in October, November of 2015, we had already had free trade agreements in existence was 7 of the countries: Canada, Mexico, Singapore, Peru, Australia, Chile, and Brunei. And those had been in place for nearly a decade. Duty-free, quota-free treatment pretty much across the board. What we didn't have was duty-free, quota-free treatment into Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia, and New Zealand. With TPP, and I'll just give you one anecdote, the Japanese, on a highly protected, what they call sacred sector, beef, agreed to lower their tariffs from 38.5% down to 9%. Now that deal is going forward to the benefit of the Australian and New Zealand beef and Canadian beef shippers, and our ranchers in Kansas and Missouri are not happy about that because they're going to pay that 38.5% versus 9% differential. And there are other examples: wheat, manufacturing, services, etc. And in services, for example, Malaysia is an important market. You can't just think of Americans going to visit Kota Kinabalu or other tourist sites in Malaysia. It's a very important destination for the Muslim world. They enjoy, a lot of Muslim families from the Gulf, from other parts of India, of Asia, go to Malaysia. And who wants to be there? Hyatt, Marriott, they want to expand their facilities there. On environment, you're absolutely right. A key weakness of TPP was that it required the countries to join only one, I think, of the 7 multilateral environmental agreements. And there were doubts about how enforceable those provisions were. And then there were several good news stories. One actually came from BuzzFeed. Actually, we talked about 2 years ago by Chris Hamby about the ISDS mechanism. Now, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, when she was elected Prime Minister, her first task was to go to the APEC summit in Vietnam, and on the sidelines of that, fix some of the provisions, including ISDS, at least from New Zealand's perspective, through a side letter. So, I'm not saying it was a perfect agreement, and either is NAFTA 2.0, but I would sort of stick to my guns on that it was a mistake to pull out.
Okay, I think we have, I know a couple more questions, maybe 2 more questions. Yes, go ahead.
So, one of the most important aspects of the WTO is the dispute settlement courts, and for instance, dumping cases and not setting environmental standards in cases when they're looking at them. So what are Trump's reasons for blocking those appointments, and why do you think that's correct, or do you think that's not correct?
You want to talk about the AV?
Sure. Yeah. So their administration, it's a sovereignty issue, and that I think that's how they would answer the question. In that the WTO appellate body, they have a list of examples, and actually the Democratic minority staff of the Ways and Means Committee has largely agreed in many cases with where the courts went beyond the scope of the text of the WTO, and I'm sure people can quibble about that, but their view is that the nation signed an agreement that said something in 1995, and now it's turning into something else that we didn't sign in many cases, and they've gone so far outside the bounds of legitimate interpretation of the text. So that would be their argument. And I would supplement that answer by saying, when I met with Lighthizer a year ago, no, I didn't mean this was a meeting. Actually, he spoke before a group in Washington, and he said the Europeans, they look at trade agreements as governance agreements, and we don't look at them that way. We look at them as contracts between countries. And what does that mean? Governance agreements are alive. They can be interpreted. They can change. The living constitution, that sort of thing. Contracts need to be interpreted as to the 4 corners of the contract. And so that's kind of the dichotomy, I think, that you're seeing with the administration's approach.
Okay, any more questions? Yes, sir.
Just a quick question on to Michael. When you mentioned about the United States and Chinese trade relations, and if for some reasons or any reasons you go down the tube, the relationship go bad in the future between United States and China, do you think that there are alternative supply sources available? Countries like Vietnam, countries like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, could be a new supply source for United States economy for the low-end manufacturing goods. And at the same time, if you can comment on the India and United States trading relationship, because India is really doing a good thing for U.S. economy in terms of providing low-cost service. So that's the service economy. So just a comment on that.
I'm sure that's not a quick answer though, but maybe we'll take the first part and.
Yeah, sure. We're not going to get duffel bag sewing back to the U.S. Let's think of it this way. If you change the relative, pricing, which really, where the trade flows are about relative pricing. Is it, largely, is it cheaper to get it here or there, and then you try to rejigger with that, whether it's exchange rates or local advantages or something like that. But let's say that we shifted the cost advantage to the U.S. of 25% and away from China with the things that we buy. If we're out of the money by 50%, it's still not coming back. If we're out of the money by 8%, it might come back. Or maybe it'll go to Vietnam or a third country. And certainly we're seeing a lot of the low-end work move out of China right now. So certainly you're going to see third countries have some opportunities. Now you'll see some of it move back to the U.S. where we are in the money. You got to take into account more than price. You got to take into account the headaches of dealing with a supply chain that's on the other side of the world, and the language, and you can only do one email a day, and you get a response the next day, and then blah blah blah. So that's been a headache. So something like that is a major driver of what would or could happen.
Just since Raj has been an expert on India in various ways, maybe you could comment briefly on the India-U.S. relationship.
Sure. I mean, I think both India and the United States appreciate the geostrategic nature of closer commercial ties. The problem for Prime Minister Modi, aside from the $1 trillion of investment he needs in infrastructure to realize at least its comparative advantages in agriculture and manufacturing, services, it's pretty much there, is he needs to reform the colossally high bound tariff rates that India has that impede U.S. market access, a huge array of non-tariff barriers, and of course corruption. That India, under the previous prime minister, previous prime ministers had tackled those, starting with the '91 reforms, but they petered out by the late 1990s. He sidetracked himself with demonetization. Modi did, and that was somewhat of a disaster. So I think one plus point is if the prime minister were to enter into FTA negotiations seriously with the U.S., it would create a lot of external pressure on India to do the necessary domestic reforms that I mentioned, which they've been needing to do for a long time. And they have not been able to transcend their own domestic political opposition, so maybe American pressure would help.
Okay, so one last question. I know it's been, and we'll wrap it up. Is there one more question out there? Oh, yes, sir.
I'll ask it.
Okay.
To what extent does and should trade policies take into account what the deficit is? Meaning, if we've got a deficit with countries where we're buying things that are arguably more important, like steel and aluminum, to security interests, or industries that are, I think, more important than, for example, like shaving cream or selfie sticks. Meaning, if we're bringing in a lot of these items that aren't, I would argue, very important, although everybody else looks like they use them.
Yeah, a lot of us like shaving cream.
Yeah. So to what extent does and should that play into how we interface with other countries?
Yeah, you're really getting into a great question of industrial strategy. I mean, we've taken a real laissez, the macroeconomists say computer chips, potato chips, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. Well, we know it does matter. We probably would be better off dominating with computer chips than potato chips. And so, actually one of my board members and advisory board members are trying to work on a book of industrial policy. And China's industrial policy has moved from their 5-year plans. They started with basic industries, steel and aluminum and some other things, and then they move up and up. And China 2025 is the next big iteration that they want to have local. They want to, move up the food chain to advanced manufacturing. And indeed, the U.S. is a developed economy. We are like a colony to Asian industrial policies, and we tend to sell low-end goods to them and buy advanced manufacturing goods back. We have a big manufacturing deficit with China. Advanced manufactured and advanced technology goods with China. So we're going the wrong way. And we don't get good at that because we think, we're going to pick winners and losers, and we don't admit that every government decision is picking a winner and a loser, and we're really bad at it because we don't admit that we even do it. So industrial organization is what you're really talking about. How do you choose what industries of the future you want to be in that produce the innovation, that can absorb lots of capital, that employ a bunch of people? Because Silicon Valley and the latest app is really cool, but it's got 3 to 5 people, right? It's not much in the scheme of things. And one of the basic duties of a government is to provide a full or close to full or decent level of employment for its citizens, because if you don't, they'll find another government that can. And 66% of our workforce doesn't have a 4-year degree. You're not going to educate your way out of that. So you got to get your economic mix right. That's not an answer. It's saying we got to get good at it, and that's why composition of trade is important.
Okay, one last word.
Very quickly, I would say that maybe foolishly, I'm still a believer in what open economy macroeconomists call the J curve, which is if foreign exchange rates are flexible and allowed to correct for trade imbalances, then trade imbalances do correct over time. The second thing is, I don't think that trade policy should be driven by the structural imbalance issue more than our overall economic policy is about focusing on savings and investment rates, because many economists would say, putting FX rates aside, the long-run determinants of trade imbalances are really saving and investment rates. And then I would definitely echo what Michael just said. Really, the investment in human capital, which this country is woefully inadequately doing, is going to be a long-run determinant of growth.
Okay, so there's an eager class outside. I don't know why they're so excited about coming in, but so thank you so much. Thank our speakers. Thank you.